quite a way behind schedule with short about the here. You see that there's a whole load of different trace gases that are exchanged with the atmosphere and also aerosol particles. They're exchanged to and from the biosphere and the atmosphere, and therefore we can expect to have, I will admit, covered in about to have. If you've heard of effect on the climate and a short atmospheric lifetime, and by short in this sense, I'm defining as something from days to about a decade or so. I mean, you can define it in different ways. Short in comparison to CO2, I think, is the important thing here. So this can be particulate matter, which we term PM, so aerosol particles, which also includes a kind of special category of black carbon. It can be tropospheric ozone, methane. It also includes hydrofluorocarbons, the successors to CFCs, but who cares from a land use set of connections? All things that have lead to some of them. So PVOCs, every presentation about here, if gases, so I think the gases ringed here in red, you could consider to be an SLCP. Basically, they have relatively short lifetimes in the atmosphere. And you can see pretty directly that the radiative forcing is associated with these gases, particularly CH4, but also with CO, VOCs, NOx. In this case of this category here, you're seeing most of the forcing through, most of the increase in forcing through a change in ozone. You also get a bit of a decrease in the methane lifetime due to NOx. I'll come back to that later. But you can see, if you add all of these little bits up, that you get a radiative forcing in total that's pretty similar to that which you get from CO2 up to the present day relative to 1750. So it seems that these things have quite a large forcing on climate, and the initial idea you get on looking at this is, right, if we can reduce these, this will really help us out in averting serious climate change. But there's another aspect to this which I think is really quite important to highlight, and that's the issue of the timescale. So this is some what I think are quite interesting plots from idealized plots from a paper by, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. I mean, it's going to have some French note on it that I'm not going to get. But what he basically did was take a 200-year greenhouse gas emission, generic greenhouse gas, which peaks after 100 years and then dies away to nothing. And then calculated the temperature response using a simple climate model, depending on what the lifetime of that greenhouse gas was, assuming that they all had the same level of radiative forcing. So if you have a gas with a lifetime that's either infinite or 1,000 years, you get a very large temperature response. And this is because as you keep putting that gas into the atmosphere, you build up the concentration again and again and again and again. So you get a cumulative effect of that gas on the radiative forcing and on the temperature response. If you compare that to a gas or a forcing agent with a lifetime of just 5 or 10 years, so the lifetime of methane, or even less in the case of most other SLCPs, then the effect of reducing the emissions by the same amount is really very small, because in any case, you put it into the atmosphere, it only stays there 10 years anyway. So if you stop all emissions now, in 10 years, it's all gone, or all the anthropogenic effect is gone. So you have to be quite careful when you're comparing these different types of gases and their effect on the climate. And just adding up radiative forcing doesn't really do the trick. And there's been some talk about if we reduce the emissions of these SLCPs, we can buy ourselves some time in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. If we reduce them now, then maybe the peak warming won't be quite so much, and we can start reducing CO2 emissions in 20 years instead of now. And this plot shows that really isn't the case, because this is the change in global mean temperature with no CO2 mitigation temperature increase. Reducing the emissions reduces the overall rate. If we, for half a degree, but by the time you've accumulated all those extra CO2 emissions, you might already be committed to several more degrees of warming, just because you avoided the emissions in between that time. So this is kind of a little bit of a warning to start off before we go into the different gases and agents that are involved, to really think about what it means to have not just different radiative forcings, but different lifetimes and and what that means, what we have to do to mitigate climate change. N2O has a longer lifetime. So N2O has a lifetime of on the order of a couple of 100 years. So it's kind of midway between CO2 and the others. So there's the 100-year gas on this plot, if I find my mouse, is about here. So I'm just gonna go through now in turn some of these different forcing agents. So starting off with particulate matter, this is basically any particle small enough to be suspended in the atmosphere. And if it's above about 20 micrometers in diameter, then you find it's lost pretty quickly by gravitational settling. The ones less than 10 micrometers have a relatively long lifetime. We generally term them PM10. We're also interested in them because of their health issues, and it's for humans and for animals. There's a brought forward each pollution and their polluters, and generally the exception being really quite complicated, and it's really not something that, I mean, it would be at least a whole lecture to talk about it, but just to say this is the general sort of effect. There are also indirect effects that relate to how aerosols modify cloud composition. So they can change the particle number in clouds, which can change the reflectivity of clouds, and these are kind of knock-on effects that are very hard to quantify. In terms of lifetime, you have them in the atmosphere for timescales on the order of days to weeks. So they're not well mixed like CO2 is. They have differential effects across the globe. But they're still long enough that they can be transported significantly. So in Europe, we see the effect of particulate emissions in North America. In the UK, about half the particulate matter that you have in the atmosphere, unless you're right in the middle of a big city, the background comes from outside of the country, comes across the Atlantic. And so aerosols are either emitted directly, so we term these primary aerosol, or they also be formed in the atmosphere from the chemistry of other gases. And we term this secondary aerosol. And one particular source of these is from the oxidation of volatile organic compounds. In terms of land use, we can reduce the relevance a little bit. So the land use related sources they relate to biomass burning, aerosols directly. These are emitted by plants. Ralph, quite an important pollen, but these are. And I put a natural sources of aerosol, which is shown in this picture, is dust. And there's some parts of the world where overgrazing is leading to a loss of vegetation cover and becoming increasingly dusty. The Sahel would be maybe a classic example. And maybe this leads to likely this leads to a change in the aerosol burden. That's pretty much all I'm going to talk about for aerosols. So without going into a lot more detail, the effects from land use change are fairly first order. They're not really first order, but it's too complex. That's it. I want to talk instead about methane. So methane's a major greenhouse gas. The radiative forcing per molecule is about 26 times that for CO2. The radiative forcing just from methane concentrations in the atmosphere amounts to something like a quarter or a third of that of CO2, depending on where you draw the baseline. It also has a small effect on water vapor in the stratosphere. This is a small warming, but it's relatively minor in comparison. Another thing that methane does is it's a primary precursor for tropospheric ozone concentrations. So it not only has a radiative forcing directly, but through how it affects the concentrations of other gases. Although having said this, its effect on ozone is relatively diffuse. It doesn't lead to particularly high ozone episodes because its reaction rate in the atmosphere is so slow, and it becomes well mixed from its sources before it's really properly oxidized. And the reason for that is because it has a lifetime of about 12 years. So you get this very well mixed concentrations around the globe. The sources, the kind of anthropogenic biogenic sources are the ones relevant to land use change. Almut mentioned these before. I think I have them better on the next slide actually. So this slide here shows many things. I think Ben would call it a talkative slide. It's the increase. This dashed line here is the increase in the atmospheric mixing ratio of methane since 1980. And the solid line shows the atmospheric growth rate per year. So you see the growth rate is growing. It's growing at a range of somewhere between 0 and 10 parts per billion per year. And these little bar graphs at the bottom show the balance between the sources and the sinks. And if we just zoom in on the one for the year 2000, you see that the sources here on the left-hand side of the picture, they're dominated by emissions from wetlands, natural wetlands mostly, and from agriculture and waste decomposition on the other side in blue. And this portion here is from fossil fuel emissions, and then this little portion here is direct emissions from biomass burning. So we have emissions that are really heavily dominated by the natural system, but also substantially influenced from the anthropogenic side as well. So some of these, in a bit more detail, rice paddies, about 5 to 6% of global emissions at the moment. If you change the amount of your rice paddy distribution, and you're changing or not your distribution, but your amount and the way you go about that agriculture, you can have a reasonably substantial effect on the methane emissions. Similarly, if you change the number of ruminants, so the number of cattle and similar animals, then this have quite a substantial effect on global emissions. 14% of the current emissions come from ruminant emissions. If we were to go about draining wetlands, we could have quite a substantial effect. So we'd reduce the conditions in which methane is produced, and these wetlands are making up 30%. And then, of course, we had this small source relative to biomass burning, and this relates to land use emissions through aspects such as land clearance and management. Often land is cleared by burning, or it's managed burns are used as a way of controlling the biomass. So there's ways in which land use change interacts with methane, and I picked out just one example here on the right, which is a paper about the expansion of rice agriculture in the Holocene. And what they're showing here is the increase of methane concentration from about 6,000 years ago, from 600 parts per billion up to about just over 700. And what was actually expected was that the methane concentration would decrease. This is based on ice core measurements and proxies, which show that typically at this stage in the glacial cycle you have a decrease in the concentration of methane in the atmosphere rather than the increase which is observed. And what they did was reconstruct the pattern of rice agriculture and how it had expanded, particularly in the East and South Asia, and linked this, kind of basically correlated this with the increase in methane, and suggested that the increase in methane concentration could be attributed to agriculture. So quite a nice example of maybe how land use change can change methane concentrations in the atmosphere. So next up, ozone. It's got an overall radiative forcing that's quite similar to that of methane. It's very hard to give it a radiative forcing in terms of per ppb, like you do for methane, and relate it to how strong the radiative forcing per molecule is, because ozone actually has a very short lifetime in the atmosphere, which makes such calculations kind of difficult or meaningless. So it's got a lifetime of hours to days, depending on the atmospheric conditions. It's really not well mixed. So if you look at this map on the right here, this is some model ozone concentrations or mixing ratios, and you see that there's very high concentrations in some parts of the land surface, and on others it's really much lower. It's not just a problem for radiative forcing, it also has substantial health effects. Ozone is one of the gases that's been shown to have significant respiratory effects, and of course it's correlated with quite substantial levels of mortality when the mixing ratios reach a high level. So the World Health Organization defines a level of 50 parts per billion as anything above that being considered damaging for human health. It's also important for plants. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that increases in ozone can decrease the net primary productivity of both natural vegetation and crops. which I'll go into just a little bit more detail in a moment. And in terms of sources, ozone isn't emitted. Ozone is formed in the atmosphere, and it's formed in the atmosphere from a variety of different compounds, but mostly it's a combination of organic compounds, so methane or biogenic volatile organics, any kind of volatile organic compound, and chemistry with nitrogen oxide emissions. So this is an example from a paper by Stephen Sitch a few years ago. He put the effect of ozone on plant productivity into a global vegetation model. And so what you see here is the present concentrations, mixing ratios even, of ozone in summer, Northern Hemisphere summer, June, July, August. And again, for 2100, under a strong emissions scenario, you see these very large increases in the ozone mixing ratio, particularly over the tropical regions. And then these lower plots show the changes in the gross primary productivity due to ozone. And they show the plots for this scenario here, I believe, with a low ozone sensitivity and a high ozone sensitivity. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty over how much effect ozone actually has on plants. But what you can see here is, nonetheless, the reduction in the plant productivity is substantial. We're talking on the order of 0 to 10% across the tropical forest in this low sensitivity map with these high mixing ratios, to over 30% with a high sensitivity. And this is a huge change in the primary productivity. These are based on extrapolations from just a few measurements. So this is typically what we tend to do in global modeling, is take a few measurements and extrapolate them to the globe and see what the sensitivity would be. So you shouldn't take these as gospel truth by any means, but they're just an indication of one of these sensitivities in the climate system and how they interact with each other. This is another paper, but this time looking at the effects on crop yields. It's quite well documented that ozone reduces crop yields. Here they've looked at the effects of ozone on soybean, wheat and maize yields for different countries. And so this is the relative yield loss going from quite small in blue to quite large in red. Red is over 30% yield loss. And there's two different metrics here for calculating it. We're quite unsure whether ozone has an ever-increasing effect. So from starting from a 0 mixing ratio, you increase it, and you gradually get a proportionally larger effect, or whether there's a threshold above which it starts to be detrimental, and below it, it doesn't really matter. I would tend to subscribe to the first view based on just a kind of ecological viewpoint, but very often in epidemiological studies for humans, they take the threshold into account. It's kind of convenient for regulators as well. Now, ozone brings me on to biogenic volatile organic compounds, because these are very important for the formation of ozone. And we know that we emit volatile organic compounds anthropogenically. We emit them from our cars. The evaporation of petrol is an example of a volatile organic compound going into the atmosphere. But the emission from plants outweighs that from anthropogenic sources by about 10 to 1. It's really the biogenic sources that dominate the global budget. And what's more, they're more reactive, so they have more concentrated effects, typically, than the anthropogenic ones do. It's also an important precursor for the production of secondary organic aerosol. Very, very broadly speaking, the heavier the compound is, the more likely it is to condense and form an aerosol. So, so if we look at this breakdown here, this is a breakdown of global BVOC emissions by compound, and you can see there's one compound that pretty much dominates everything, and that's isoprene, which is a molecule C5H8. It's one of the lightest VOCs, and this doesn't have a great potential to form aerosol. There's a bit of uncertainty over what the yields from it might be, but overall the yield from isoprene is quite low. You can contrast this to monoterpenes here, which are reckon to be about 10% of global emissions. They're basically two isoprene molecules stuck together in all kinds of different combinations. And they form a lot of organic aerosol in comparison. And then if you go to sesquiterpenes, which are even larger, these things react so quickly in the atmosphere we can barely measure them. But they're believed to have a very large contribution to this aerosol, which is completely in disproportion to their overall contribution to emissions. So a little bit about these compounds and how they're emitted. The emission changes very much depending on the environmental conditions. So isoprene I'm going to take as the classic example because it dominates the global emissions, and many of these aspects hold true for other compounds. Isoprene emission is really controlled by temperature and light. So as the level of light increases, you get a strong increase in the isoprene emission, which gradually tails off as that light level saturates out, just like you see for photosynthesis. There's also a very strong temperature response, even stronger than the one to light. So if you have emissions at 20 degrees C, can be several times lower than those at 30 degrees. Very, very strong response, which eventually tails off at high temperatures. Monoterpenes, some of them have a light dependence, some of them don't. Some of them are emitted throughout the day and the night. Isoprenes only emitted during the day. As well as this, and very important for global change studies, there's evidence that isoprene emissions are inhibited by CO2. So you might expect that global change would lead to an increase in temperatures and an increase in isoprene emission, and this is what the early studies suggested. But actually, when you take into account the inhibition by CO2, this cancels out a lot, if not all of that effect. So it can be quite a complex calculation to figure out exactly what's going to happen. The other extremely important aspect in emissions of these compounds is what kind of species you have on the ground. So if you have a broadleaf tree, you have much higher emissions of isoprene than you have from a needleleaf tree. But conversely, you generally have lower emissions of monoterpenes than from needleleaf trees. So the boreal forest is quite a high emitter of monoterpenes, and the tropical and temperate forests tend to be relatively high emitters of isoprene. In contrast, crops emit almost none of these compounds. So if you go around changing your forest into cropland, you fundamentally change the emissions of these croplands into the emissions of these compounds into the atmosphere. Now, I'm gonna go into a little bit more detail here because I think the ozone chemistry is particularly interesting and much more non-linear than just a case of we replace forests by cropland and we change the emissions and therefore we change the burden in the atmosphere. Ozone doesn't really work that way. So I'm going to go through a little bit of atmospheric chemistry, and I hope you'll bear with me as we go through it because hopefully in the end you'll see why I did it. So ozone is formed in the troposphere. This just relates to tropospheric ozone, nothing to do with the stratosphere, from the photolysis of nitrogen dioxide, which is why the concentrations of NOx in the atmosphere, the emissions of NOx, suddenly become relevant for ozone formation. And this reaction produces a free oxygen molecule, and that oxygen molecule free oxygen atom, which rapidly combines with a free oxygen molecule to form ozone. However, the reaction also produces an NO molecule, a nitrogen oxide molecule, and this NO molecule can then react again with ozone to reform NO2 and molecular oxygen. So what you have here is a kind of on its own a closed cycle, which gives you a steady state ozone concentration, which depends on the amount of NOx you have in the atmosphere and the amount of solar irradiation you have. And this is usually something around 10 to 25 parts per billion. So really it's well within the levels we'd consider safe and background. But if we have another route that transforms NO into NO2 as well as that reaction with ozone, then maybe these ozone mixing ratios could start to increase, because instead of that NO reacting with ozone, it's reacting with something else. And that's exactly what we do have in reality. So we have these radicals in the atmosphere called peroxy radicals, these HO2, the methyl peroxy radical, and this just generic organic peroxy radical. And these can react with that NO and reform NO2. So not only do they stop that NO reacting with ozone, they also replace the NO2 in the atmosphere, which can then again be photolysed and start to create more ozone. And so what this can do is lead to basically an explosion of your ozone mixing ratio. You can quickly have mixing ratios building up far beyond that you'd have in the background atmosphere without this effect. So where do these these peroxy radicals come from? Well, these come from the oxidation of organic molecules. So the example at the bottom here is from methane. If you oxidize methane by OH, which is its primary loss source in the atmosphere, in the troposphere, then you produce this methyl radical and water, and then that methyl radical reacts with oxygen and forms this highly reactive peroxy radical, which has a lifetime of a very, very short lifetime, a second or less in the atmosphere. And this kind of reaction is the same also for VOC. So the particular details of the reaction are different, but the essence of it is exactly the same. So when you have this extra route to form ozone, which comes from the addition of these organic molecules into the atmosphere, you can suddenly get these very high concentrations. And if it was just that simple, we'd have a very linear effect, and I wouldn't need to go through all this chemistry to explain it to you. But actually, it's not quite that simple, because it depends on the chemistry that you get dominating depends on the concentration of NOx that you have in the atmosphere. So if you have a lot of NOx in the atmosphere, then this reaction, where's my mouse gone? There's my mouse. This reaction dominates, and you get this reformation of NO2. If you don't have much NOx in the atmosphere, which is the case for instance, in the remote tropical forests, then instead of these peroxy radicals reacting with NOx, they tend to react with each other and they form peroxides. And peroxides don't stay in the atmosphere very long. They tend to be deposited out and lost completely from the chemistry. In addition, you also have the reaction of ozone directly with the organic molecules, just called R in this case, which lead to a variety of products that don't really matter. But my point here is that if you have lower levels of NOx in the atmosphere, then you not only have less capacity to produce ozone, but you can actually actively start to lose it. And that's what this lovely plot shows. So this is an example of what we term an isoplex diagram. And basically what you see is the change in ozone mixing ratio as you increase VOC emissions along the bottom here and NOx emissions up the side. You can equally make this with concentrations. It has exactly the same shape. So you see that basically as you increase, where's my mouse? There's my mouse. As you increase NOx emissions, then you get a strong increase in ozone mixing ratio. But if your VOC emissions are very low, then that maximum level of increase of ozone is much lower than if you have high VOCs. So if you have high VOCs and high NOx, you have a lot of potential to create ozone. Similarly, if you have, say, take this middling NOx emission, you start off by increasing your VOCs, you initially increase your ozone concentration, and then you get to a point where the chemistry flips from this mode where it's effectively limited by the minimum amount, by the amount of VOCs that are available, and it becomes limited by the amount of NOx instead. And then instead of more VOCs increasing the amount of ozone, they start to decrease it again. So that the effect of the BVOCs on the ozone is really quite dependent on the background chemistry of the atmosphere. And we typically say that BVOCs, an increase in BVOC emissions will increase ozone in remote. Sorry, it'll decrease ozone in remote low NOx regions and increase it in polluted high NOx regions, such as the mid-latitudes. I just want to quickly draw your attention to another aspect here. This is when you have this reaction of NO and HO2, you also produce the OH radical. And as I mentioned just before, the OH radical is the major loss of methane, the major loss rate of methane. So by putting these NOx and VOCs into the atmosphere, you change the chemistry that leads to the loss of methane, and you can actually change the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere and hence change the radiative forcing effect. And it's reckoned that the isoprene emissions can have an effect up to 10% on the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere, which is not inconsequential. So now I just want to go through a couple of examples of some land use change cases and how they might change BVOCs and ozone and aerosols. So this is an example from a campaign we made in Borneo about 5 years ago. The looking at we measured the emissions of isoprene from the rainforest, and then the emissions of isoprene from an oil palm plantation. And as you've seen already in the last couple of days, there's a lot of transfer in Southeast Asia, particularly in Borneo, of the tropical rainforest being cut down and converted into oil palm plantations. But they have these fundamentally different isoprene emission rates. And this plot shows that effect. So along the bottom here, we have the NOx concentration, and along the y-axis, the ozone concentration. And these two black dots here show the measured position of the rainforest and the oil palm plantation as they are at the moment. So actually, the oil palm emits much more isoprene than the rainforest, but because of these nonlinear effects of chemistry and the fact that there's not much background NOx in this area, they come out with pretty similar ozone mixing ratios. There is slightly more NOx in the oil palm. There's some fertilization going on. There's mechanization, and there's also burning of the parts of the plant that they don't require. But it's nowhere near enough to really make ozone emissions kick off, ozone production kick off. But if we increase the NOx, and that's what these lines show, these are outputs from a atmospheric chemistry model, to the levels that we have in background Western Europe, for example, which is somewhere around the 2 to 5 parts per billion range. So here, you see that if you have the rainforest and you increase the background NOx because you've industrialized in the local area, then you don't get ozone mixing ratios that get particularly high. They stay generally below 50 parts per billion, so we're not too worried. But in the case of the oil palm, the chemistry really kicks off, and you get these incredibly high mixing ratios, which are really quite serious. You know, something of 100 parts per billion is going to have very significant health effects as well as effects on plants and crops. Another example in the opposite direction. So this is a conversion of forest to cropland, but in the tropics. This is a study with a global atmospheric chemistry model, and they. So when they transferred the forest to the cropland, they reduced the isoprene emissions because crops emit basically no isoprene, and that's what you see here, a reduction in isoprene emissions in this plot. But because that situation is a low NOx environment, that reducing of these emissions actually increases the potential to form ozone. So they found that in the tropical rainforest, they had an increase of ozone, or the area of the tropical rainforest, they had an increase of ozone, despite reducing the VOC emissions. However, it is worth pointing out that the background ozone here is very small. So while you may have a small effect on the radiative forcing by changing the concentration of ozone over that particular area, it's really not relevant for health when you only have background mixing ratios of 20 parts per billion. If you increase it by 30%, it doesn't make much difference. But just to show that it doesn't always go in the obvious direction. And this is an example for the mid-latitudes. So it's once again, it's a forest to cropland conversion. This is in this study, the current cover of croplands in the US. This is a future scenario of cropland cover with a very strong increase. And that leads to a very strong decrease in isoprene emissions. But because the US background is polluted, it has a lot of NOx and therefore a lot of ozone. This decrease in isoprene emissions leads to a decrease in ozone. So actually, this increase in cropland has in some way a positive effect on the ozone concentration. I showed this example here. We've been talking about biofuel production, and Sebastian showed some examples of coppicing and the effect that has on carbon. This is the effect of short rotation coppice plantations on BVOC emissions. So it's some work done by Kirsty Ashworth in Lancaster a few years ago. This is what she did was she suggested that all the land in Europe that wasn't currently required for agricultural production or wasn't currently protected forest could be turned into short rotation coppice. And short rotation coppice is typically eucalyptus or poplar plantations we're thinking of, and these have much higher isoprene mixing ratios than the forest that they might be replacing, and certainly more than the croplands that they're replacing. So this here shows the the increase in vegetation, or the fraction of the vegetation in short rotation coppice, leading to an increase in the isoprene emissions. And this led to an increase in the mixing ratio of ozone, and in particular to the number of days per year in these regions in which this ozone exceeded the acceptable limit set by the EU. So the top part of this plot, which I somehow managed to stupidly obscure, is going up to 50 or 60 days. So that's 50 or 60 more days per year when your ozone is above a level which is considered acceptable. So this is quite an extreme scenario, of course, but it's a scenario that allows you to investigate the sensitivity of the system. And what Kirsty calculated was that about 1,400 deaths per year would be brought forward because of this change in ozone mixing ratios, based on results from epidemiological studies. And so this plot here is really just summarizing these effects for these different conversions. So the crop to grassland conversion to short rotation coppice, you increase the emissions, you increase the ozone, you increase the aerosol also. Similarly for the change in North America, the oil palm gives you something similar in the tropics, but when you have the Amazon effect, the forest crops in the Amazon, then you have the decrease in isoprene emissions, it gives you a decrease in aerosol, but it gives you an increase in ozone. So just to summarize those effects. And lastly, I just want to finish this off by saying that it's not all about emissions, the effect of the biosphere on these short-lived constituents of the atmosphere, because the biosphere also captures these species through deposition. So ozone particles, even some VOCs, can be directly deposited to plants. We reckon about 25% of tropospheric ozone is lost by deposition as opposed to chemical processes. We don't really need to go through these in too much detail, but just to say that the deposition flux is a function of what we term a deposition velocity and the concentration. And this deposition velocity is an empirical parameter, but we generally break it down into resistances. So there's a resistance related to the aerodynamics, just as Ben described earlier for the heat fluxes. They're exactly the same resistances that apply for heat fluxes, also apply for fluxes of gases, at least in principle. And also important is the surface resistance. So the surface resistance is affected by, in the case of particles, how sticky the leaves are. Different plants have different affinities for taking up particles on their leaves, or how open the stomata are in case of gases. Ozone is primarily taken up through the stomata. And these deposition velocities change with land cover. So this is just some characteristic examples of ozone deposition velocity, and you can see that for long grass it's typically less than it is for trees, and for short grass it's typically less than it is for long grass. It's a combination of changes in surface resistance and changes in the roughness length, which generate changes in the aerodynamic resistance. And that's where I'm going to finish. So it's really just to say that the land use can also influence the concentrations of things that aren't CO2 and that aren't just a surface energy balance. But the overall effect of these changes is not always quite so clear-cut, and it can be heavily dependent on other things and other aspects of the context. Nor do we even understand the magnitude, or in some cases the direction of these changes, especially when it comes to aerosols. And really, it's probably fair to say that the effect of these things on human health and on crop yields is more important than the effect of these land use induced changes on the climate, certainly for things like ozone and certainly for things like ozone. And I'm going to leave it there and go through my references.